Hi everyone, my name is Destiny Blade, and today we are going to be covering parts of the brain. So first we're going to cover specific structures of the brain and their functions. So here I have an outline of the parts and structures that we're going to cover of the forebrain, of the midbrain, and the hindbrain. And I'll also briefly mention the spinal cord. So first we'll cover the forebrain, and then the midbrain, and then the hindbrain. And the forebrain, here in orange, we'll find our structures in orange. And then the midbrain, we'll find our structures in the green. And then if it's in the hindbrain, we'll find our structures here in the peachy pink color. Okay, so the cingulate gyri, it's part of the cerebral cortex. It's also part of the limbic system, and it's responsible for motivations and emotions such as anxiety and aggression. It plays a role in sexual activity, in eating, and drinking. So your cingulate gyri is going to be in this green area here. And like I said, it's part of the cerebral cortex. So I'm going to stay here. And the cerebral cortex is the outer portion of the brain. All the lumps, the bumps, and the grooves. The cerebral cortex includes fissures, gyri, sulcus, gray and white matter. So also part of the cerebral cortex that I want to mention while we're here is the corpus callosum. And you'll see the corpus callosum here in the beige tan color. Now, the corpus callosum is a bundle of axons that allows for communication between each hemisphere of the brain. So next we're going to cover the hypothalamus. Now hypo means below. So the hypothalamus is below the thalamus. Now the hypothalamus controls things such as eating and drinking and temperature regulation, but it also controls reproductive behaviors, fighting, and activity levels. Now you can find the hypothalamus if you look for the pituitary gland. Now it hangs off a bit here. You're just going to go right up, and it's this little area right here. This is your hypothalamus. Now your pituitary gland, like I said, it hangs off here. The pituitary gland receives information from the hypothalamus to send messages to endocrine glands to alter hormones, the release of hormones into the bloodstream. And then the last thing that we're going to cover for the forebrain is the thalamus. Now, the thalamus, again, will be above the hypothalamus. So you're going to find your pituitary gland, go up from the, here's the hypothalamus, and you're going to go up, and here's your thalamus. Now, the thalamus processes information, motor, and processes sensory information and sends it out to the cerebral cortex, which again is just the outer brain. Let me go back real quick and mention we're moving on to the midbrain. So it's going to be in this area here. And we're going to talk about the superior and the inferior colliculi. And the superior colliculi and inferior colliculi are going to be in this area here, right next to the cerebellum. Now, the superior colliculi is important for vision, while the inferior colliculi is important for hearing. So you can see here we've got our pituitary gland, our hypothalamus, our thalamus, and then below that we've got our midbrain right here. So next we're going to start on the hindbrain. Now first we're going to cover the medulla. You'll see the little protrusion here is the medulla, and it does vital reflexes such as vomiting, sneezing, coughing, heart rate, breathing. And then we have the pons, and the pons is up above the medulla. It is a bridge for the axons to cross over the brain, so it's able to communicate and complete what the task it needs to complete. Then the last part of the hindbrain we're going to cover is the cerebellum. Now, cerebellum means little brain, and it's this blue-green color right here. It controls movement, balance, and coordination. The last part of this section that I want to cover is the spinal cord. And the spinal cord is within the brain stem. It'll be here, and it receives and sends motor commands to and from the brain. Next, we're going to talk about sulci and fissures. The next slide, I have this brain pre-highlighted for you, so it may be easier to see, but I wanted to show distinctions of how you may be able to find these. So the calcareon fissure, you'll find the occipital lobe, or you can look for the cerebellum. The occipital lobe will be here. And so your calcareon fissure is going to be right around this area here. Then your lateral fissure, it's a part of the temporal lobe. And so you've got this divot here, and you're just going to follow it up. It's this steep groove. Then you'll have your longitudinal fissure. It splits the left and right hemisphere of the brain. It's an easier to see over here at this top image. And then the last sulcine fissure that we're going to cover is the central sulcus. So no surprise, it's in the center of the brain. It splits, it goes in between the precentral gyrus and the postcentral gyrus. It's right here. And so where this is the longitudinal, the central sulcus is this way. So here, as I said, I have them highlighted for you. So you see your longitudinal fissure splitting left and right. And then you're coming from your central sulcus coming in the other way. Then you've got your calcareon fissure. You see your cerebellum. So here's your occipital lobe, and you'll find your calcareon fissure. And then your lateral fissure, you see the divot here, and you're just going to come up and follow the deep groove. So next we're going to talk about lobes. The frontal lobe, parietal lobe, occipital lobe, and temporal lobe. So first, I enjoyed this image because you get to see it from all different perspectives. So from the side of the brain, from the back of your head, from the front of your face down at the bottom left, and then from the top of your head, looking down from the bottom right. So the frontal lobe will be here in pink, and it is responsible for fine motor movement and planning. Fine motor movement meaning dexterity in your fingers and things of that nature. Then we'll move on to the parietal lobe. The parietal lobe receives sensations from touch and joint and muscle receptors. It's also important for head, eye, and body positions, and all of these are important so that it can help control your movement. The parietal lobe is here in blue. It also does spatial and numerical information. So next we have the occipital lobe. The occipital lobe is in green. It is important for visual information. Now the brain is contralateral and upside down. So the back of your brain is going to control the eyes. So you'll see that the majority of the back of your brain is taken up by the occipital lobe. And then lastly, we have the temporal lobe, which is important for auditory information. You will see it in orange. You can see each hemisphere of the brain has part of the temporal lobe. This is true for all lobes of the brain. It is on each hemisphere of the brain. Specifically for temporal, though, the left lobe controls the language. The temporal lobe is also involved in emotional and motivational behaviors, movement perception, and important visual processing such as facial recognition. The last thing that I'm going to cover today are your primary cortices. So your central sulcus, as I mentioned, goes down between your primary motor cortex and your primary somatosensory cortex. So your primary motor cortex is known as your precentral gyrus. It, of course, controls movement. Now, it's important to note that no specific area of the brain controls an individual or specific muscle. Next, we're going to talk about this primary somatosensory cortex, or the postcentral gyrus, and it's going to be here in pink, and it's important for feeling sensations, such as pain. Next, the primary visual cortex is also known as the striate cortex, and it is here in blue. It lies along the calcareon fissure, and again, it's important for visual processing and information. Then the last thing I'm going to cover is the primary auditory cortex, which of course is important for auditory information. And you can find this if you go to your temporal lobe, the lateral fissure. It's going to be right here in this blue-green area is where you'll find your primary auditory cortex. Thanks for listening to me today.